My brother shook the lawyer's hand before the man had even finished packing up his briefcase. That image is burned into my memory. The way Raymond stood up from the chair, our mother's dining room chair, the one she'd reupholstered twice because she loved the fabric, and extended his hand toward the attorney like he was closing a business deal. Like the previous 40 minutes hadn't just been the reading of our mother's will, like he hadn't just inherited everything she'd spent 81 years building. I sat across the table and I didn't move. I couldn't. My hands were folded in my lap. I could feel the wood of the chair beneath me. The same chair I'd sat in at every Christmas dinner, every birthday, every Sunday supper for the first 18 years of my life. And I thought she left me nothing. After everything, after all of it, she left me nothing. The lawyer said my name once. Near the beginning, he said I was to receive personal effects to be selected by Raymond at his discretion, which meant Raymond would decide which of our mother's belongings I was allowed to take. A coffee mug. Maybe. A photograph. Whatever Raymond decided I deserved. I drove home in silence that afternoon. 43 miles. I didn't turn on the radio. I just drove. And the fields went by. And I thought about her hands, the way they looked in the last few months. Small and papery. The way old hands get. How she'd reach for mine when I came in the room. I thought she knew I was there. She had to have known. But the will said otherwise. And I was too broken to imagine anything beyond that. What I didn't know, what none of us knew, was that my mother had planned for exactly this moment. She'd been planning for 2 years. I need to back up. Because none of this makes sense without knowing who Raymond is. Who he became. I mean, because the brother I grew up with wasn't this person. We grew up on a farm in central Iowa. Our parents, Harold and Dolores Mackey, ran a grain operation for 40 years. My father built that farm from 60 acres he borrowed money to buy in 1971. And by the time he retired, it was 220 acres, free and clear. A house that had been added onto 3 times. 2 equipment barns. And a legacy he was fiercely proud of. Dad died in 2016. Heart attack. Sudden. He was out checking the south field on a Tuesday morning, and by noon he was gone. That changed everything. Not just because we lost him, though that grief was enormous. The kind that sits in your chest for years, but because it changed Raymond. Raymond was the oldest. He left Iowa at 22 to go to business school in Chicago. Came back with a wife named Brenda and an opinion about everything. He'd done well for himself. Property management company. Nice house in a suburb. 2 kids who called my mother Grandma Dolores at Christmas and forgot she existed the other 11 months of the year. I'm the younger one. I'm 63 years old. I never left. I took over the farming operation after Dad retired. Ran it alongside my parents. And when Dad died, I was the one who showed up every single day. I lived 15 minutes from the farmhouse. Raymond lived 4 hours away. For the first year after Dad died, Mom was strong. She was always a strong woman, stubborn, precise, full of opinions about casseroles and politics and the proper way to plant a garden. She had her church friends, ihr Garten, her routine. She was managing. Then she had a small stroke in the spring of 2018. Nothing catastrophic. She recovered well. But it scared her. And it scared Raymond. That's when he started coming around more. At first I was grateful. Truly. I'd been carrying the weight of being the only nearby family for 2 years. And having Raymond show up more frequently seemed like a good thing. He'd take her to doctor's appointments. He'd sit with her on the porch. He started handling her bills. Her bank accounts, just to take the stress off her. He said, just to help. I didn't see it happening. I was busy. I was farming. I was in and out every day. But I wasn't paying attention the way I should have been. The first thing I noticed was that Mom stopped asking me about the farm. For 40 years. That woman had an opinion about every crop decision my father made. She knew the price of corn, the weather patterns, the names of every field on the property. Then one day she said, almost apologetically, that Raymond thought it might be better if she let him handle the financial side of things from now on. That it was too much for her. I let it go. She was 78. She'd had a stroke. What was I supposed to say? The second thing I noticed was that Brenda Raymond's wife started coming to every family gathering, which sounds normal, but Brenda had always kept a certain distance from farm life. She'd never been unkind. Exactly. But she had a way of looking at the house, at the furniture, at the land, like she was appraising it, like she was calculating. The third thing I noticed was that Mom started apologizing to me. Not for anything specific, just out of nowhere. In the middle of a conversation, she'd get quiet and she'd say, "I want you to know I love you. Tommy," using my childhood name, the one only she ever used. And she'd squeeze my hand and look at me with something in her eyes that I couldn't quite read. Something that looked almost like sadness or guilt. I should have understood what she was telling me. I should have asked, but I thought she was just getting older. I thought it was grief. And the weight of living in a house full of her husband's memory. I didn't understand that she was trying to warn me, because she knew what Raymond was doing. She'd known for almost a year, and she was already doing something about it. Mom died in March of 2021. Peacefully, in her own bed, the way she'd always wanted. I was there. I held her hand. Raymond and Brenda arrived about 2 hours after she passed. They'd been in the middle of driving when I called. The funeral was on a Thursday. Half the county came. She'd been a fixture in that community for 60 years, a Sunday school teacher, a 4-H leader. A woman who brought food to every family in the congregation that had ever lost someone. Pastor Gerald Whitmore had known her for 34 years. He gave the eulogy. It was the finest thing I've ever heard spoken about another human being. The will reading was set for the following Monday. Raymond arranged it. He suggested we use his attorney, a man named Forsyth, who drove up from Des Moines, rather than the small-town lawyer Mom had always used. I didn't think much of it at the time. Raymond handled things efficiently. That was his way. I sat in that dining room on Monday morning with Raymond and Brenda across from me, and Attorney Forsyth at the head of the table. And I listened as my mother's final wishes were read aloud. The farm went to Raymond outright. The house went to Raymond. The liquid assets roughly $190. 0 inches savings and CDs went to Raymond. The equipment was to be sold and proceeds directed to Raymond. I was to receive personal effects at Raymond's discretion. Forsyth finished reading. Raymond stood and shook his hand. I sat there for a long moment after they'd moved toward the kitchen. I could hear Brenda making coffee, saying something about a timeline for the estate. Raymond's voice low and satisfied. And I thought about Mom's eyes. All those times she'd squeezed my hand and called me Tommy and looked at me with that sadness I couldn't name. I drove home and sat in my truck in my own driveway for 45 minutes. Then my phone rang. It was Pastor Gerald Whitmore. "Tommy," he said, "I think you need to come see me." I drove to the church. Would you have known? In that moment, what was coming I didn't. I had no idea. I walked into Pastor Whitmore's office, thinking he wanted to check on my grief. He was a pastoral man, a man who followed up with his flock. I sat down across from his desk and he looked at me for a long moment. And then he said 7 words, that I have thought about every single day since. He said, "Your mother left something with me." He reached into the bottom drawer of his desk and placed a sealed envelope on the table between us. It was manila, letter-sized. My mother's handwriting was on the front. It said, "For Tommy, not to be opened until after the reading." My hands were shaking when I picked it up. Inside was a letter, and a second, notarized will. The letter was 4 pages, handwritten, in my mother's careful schoolteacher cursive. I'm not going to read every word of it here. Some of it belongs only to me. But I will tell you what she said, because she would have wanted people to know. She started by telling me she was sorry it had to happen this way. She said she needed me to experience the reading of Raymond's will, the one he'd arranged, because she needed me to understand what he was capable of. She needed me to see it with my own eyes, so that I could never be talked into doubting it later. She wrote, "I know you, Tommy. You would have given him the benefit of the doubt. You always do. I needed you to see it for yourself." She told me what Raymond had done over the course of 2 years. Beginning shortly after her stroke, Raymond had gradually isolated her from her own financial life. He'd taken over her accounts to help, and then quietly moved money into accounts she couldn't access. He'd had her sign documents she didn't fully understand, including, eventually, a new will drafted by Forsyth, Raymond's attorney, who had no prior relationship with my mother and no independent obligation to ensure she understood what she was signing. She had signed it. She told me in the letter she signed it because Raymond sat beside her and held her hand and told her it was just an update, just paperwork. And she was tired, and she trusted him, and she didn't want conflict. But she knew, she wrote, the moment Forsyth left with those papers. She knew. And she started planning 2 weeks after signing Raymond's will. She called Pastor Whitmore and asked him to drive her to a different attorney, a woman in the next county named Carolyn Briggs, who had no connection to Raymond, no history with the family, and who had been recommended to my mother by one of her church friends. Dolores Mackey walked into Carolyn Briggs's office, sat down, and explained exactly what had happened. She told her about the stroke. She told her about Raymond. She told her about the will she'd signed under pressure, and then she dictated a new one. The new will restored the original distribution she and my father had always intended. The farm, the house, the savings to be divided equally between both sons. Raymond's half was his to keep, but so was mine. What was mine was to be given back to me. Carolyn Briggs witnessed it. Pastor Whitmore witnessed it. A notary from the county clerk's office came to the church on a Wednesday afternoon and put her seal on it. Then Mom gave the envelope to Pastor Whitmore, and she told him to keep it safe and to call me after the reading. And she went home, and she never said a word about it to anyone. If you enjoy stories about quiet strength and people who refuse to let injustice be the final word, consider subscribing. There are more stories like this one. Stories about people who made a plan and waited for the right moment. My mother made a plan. She waited 7 months for the right moment. And then she died. And the plan unfolded exactly the way she designed it. I sat in Pastor Whitmore's office for a long time after I finished reading the letter. Then I called Carolyn Briggs. She was expecting my call. She had been expecting it for 7 months. Actually, she told me she'd reviewed my mother's situation carefully, that she'd documented the process thoroughly, that she'd had extensive conversations with my mother to ensure she was of sound mind and acting freely. She told me that Dolores Mackey had been one of the sharpest clients she'd worked with in 20 years of estate law, and that my mother had been very, very clear about what she wanted. She told me that Raymond's will was almost certainly voidable on grounds of undue influence, that the circumstances under which my mother had signed it combined with the documented financial control Raymond had exercised over the preceding 2 years, gave us a strong legal foundation. But more importantly, she said, we had the second will, properly executed, properly witnessed, properly notarized, and dated after the first one, under Iowa law. The most recent properly executed will takes precedence. I asked her what we needed to do. She said, I already filed it with the probate court this morning. I hadn't even made it back to my truck before Raymond called. I've thought a lot about how to describe that phone call. Raymond is my brother. He was once my brother in every sense of the word, the kid who taught me to fish, who snuck me into movies when I was too young, who called me the night his first daughter was born, sobbing with joy. That person existed. I don't know what happened to him. I don't know if it was Brenda, or the money, or something that had always been inside him that I'd never seen clearly. But the man who called me that afternoon wasn't that person. He was furious. He said the second will was a fraud. He said our mother had been confused. He used the word dementia, which made me grip the phone so hard my knuckles went white. Because I had held her hand in those final months, and she had been the sharpest, most present, most intentional person in every room she entered. He said his attorney was going to challenge it. I said okay. He said it louder. He said I had taken advantage of a dying woman's grief and manipulated her into changing her estate. I said, Raymond, she wrote this herself. She planned it herself. She hid it from me until after the reading because she knew I'd give you the benefit of the doubt. Those are her words. Not mine. Silence. Then she was confused. She was sharp as a tack. I said, Carolyn Briggs will tell you that. Pastor Whitmore will tell you that. The notary will tell you that. And the date on that will is going to tell the probate court everything else it needs to know. He hung up. What happened next lasted 8 months. Forsyth challenged the will on Raymond's behalf. Raymond's position was that our mother had been unduly influenced by me, which was almost amusing, given that I hadn't known about the second will until 4 days after she died. Carolyn Briggs pointed this out to the court, repeatedly. With supporting documentation, Pastor Whitmore testified. He described, in his careful and measured way, the afternoon my mother had called him and asked him to drive her to meet an attorney. He described her clarity of purpose. He described the specific instructions she gave him about the envelope. He said, and I will never forget this, Dolores Mackey was one of the most deliberate people I have ever known. She did not make mistakes. She did not act in haste. Everything she did, she had considered thoroughly. This was no different. The court-appointed guardian ad litem interviewed everyone involved. They reviewed my mother's medical records. They reviewed her financial records, which, when fully examined, revealed a pattern of account transfers that Raymond struggled to explain. They reviewed the timeline of both wills. In November of 2020, the probate court ruled in favor of the second will. The farm came to me. Half the house came to me. Half the savings came to me. What was ours again. Raymond filed an appeal. His attorney withdrew before the appeal was fully briefed. Citing irreconcilable differences, the appeal was quietly abandoned in January of 2022. I haven't spoken to Raymond since. Not because I refuse, though I won't apologize. And I won't pretend the past 3 years didn't happen. But because Raymond has not attempted to reach out. Not once. Whatever he's feeling about all of it, he's keeping to himself. I'm sitting on the porch of my mother's house as I tell you this story. My house now. I suppose half of it, legally. But I don't think of it that way. I think of it as hers. I walk through those rooms, and I feel her in every corner. The kitchen where she made Sunday dinner for 60 years. The garden she tended until she couldn't anymore. The bedroom where she died. Peaceful and ready. Having done everything she needed to do, she wrote in the letter that she was sorry for the performance of it. Her word. Performance. She knew I would have to sit through the reading of Raymond's will. She knew I would drive home feeling like I'd been erased. She said she hated that. She said she'd lain awake more than once, imagining my face in that moment. And it broke her heart. But she also wrote that she needed me to have the truth without any doubt. That if she'd told me while she was alive, I would have tried to handle it myself, probably clumsily. Probably with some misguided attempt to preserve family peace, she said. You would have forgiven him before he deserved it. I know you. Tommy, I know exactly who you are. She was right. I would have. She built a fortress instead. She found a lawyer no one knew about. She enlisted a pastor no one thought to consider. She signed her name with a steady hand and hid the result in the most personal place she owned. She fought for me from inside a body that was already failing her. With everything she had left, what would you have done if you'd been in my position? When the lawyer finished reading that will and my brother shook his hand, would you have seen it coming? Would you have had any idea I didn't? Not until the phone rang and the pastor said 7 words that changed everything. If this story moved you, consider hitting like it genuinely. Helps more people find it. And if you know someone who's going through a family estate battle right now, share this. Sometimes people need to be reminded that the right outcome is still possible. Even when it looks like the door has already closed. I went back to the farm a week after the probate ruling. I walked every acre of it. The way I used to walk it with my father. The way he taught me to read the land. The south field. The creek line. The ridge where the light hits differently in the afternoon. I stood at my father's grave. He's buried in the church cemetery 2 miles down the road, and I told him what had happened. All of it. I don't know if he could hear me. I'd like to think he could. And I told him what Mom had done. How she'd planned it. How she'd thought it through with the kind of patience and precision that had always been her greatest strength. How she'd trusted the right people and protected the right things, and never once let Raymond see what she was doing. I told him she was incredible. I already knew that. I'd known it my whole life. But standing in that cemetery with the wind coming across the fields, I understood it differently. I understood that she had loved this land. And she had loved her sons, both of them. Even the one who tried to take it, and she had done the hardest thing a mother can do. She had chosen what was right over what was easy. Even at the very end. I'm sitting on her porch now. And it's a spring evening. And the fields are just starting to turn green. The same fields my grandfather broke ground on 70 years ago. The same fields my father worked. And I worked. And someday maybe a grandchild of mine will work. I have a letter in a drawer upstairs. 4 pages of careful cursive. I read it sometimes. When I need to. It starts, my dear Tommy. If you're reading this, it means it worked. It means I got to be the one who fixed it. She always did like to get the last word. She earned it. All stories on this channel are original fiction, inspired by real experiences shared by our community. Names. Location. And details are fictional. Any resemblance to real persons is coincidental